First time buyer, first time investor. When you've got your first purchase, what should you do? Hi, my name's Manda Walker. I am a mortgage advisor, but I'm also the mortgage coach, and I help people get mortgage ready. Now, one of my students asked me today, what should I do? Should I become a first time buyer or become a first time investor? Can you even become a first time investor? Now, basically, what that means is a first time buyer is buying your first home, or as we say in the mortgage industry, your first residential property. A first time investor or first time landlord means buying your first property but as an investment. Now, a couple of days ago, I was at the hairdressers and I was talking to a couple of people there. They happen to be mums and their children are in their mid-20s, and they were saying that their children are happy living where they're living, as in still at home, still with their parents, but they really want to own something. So this is an ideal situation if you want to become a first-time investor. Now, there aren't that many lenders that will allow you to buy a property as an investment when you don't actually own, but there are a few. Now, what are the pros and cons of this? Now, if you are happy where you're living, or for example, I had a client once that lived in Islington. Now he rents in Islington. Now he can't afford to buy, but he really wanted to own something, so he bought out of London. Now the pros of that is great because you get to live exactly where you want to live, but then you also get to own an investment. And sometimes if the rental is the same as what you're paying in rent, it kind of washes each other's face, as they would say, and then that way you're not paying someone else's mortgage, because what you're getting in rental income, you can actually use that to cover your rent. So that is one pro. One of the cons is normally, and it really does depend what your first investment is, but normally the stamp duty exemption, you would lose out on that. Now what that means is stamp duty, if you don't know what it is, it's a land tax. Now whenever you buy a property you have to pay stamp duty. Now the only exception to the rule is if you're a first time buyer and as of this recording your property is worth less than 300,000, you get exempt. Now the experience I've had so far, that when you buy an investment, because you're buying out of London normally, not always, then what it is the price of the properties are so much cheaper. Say in this example I was telling you about my client, it was less than 100,000. But if you bought your first property, the likelihood is it would be about 300,000. Now, my point is you lose out on getting the maximum stamp duty exemption. If they're exempting you for the first 300,000 and you only use 100,000, then you've lost the discount of 200,000, because obviously 300,000 minus the 100,000 gives you 200,000. So there is that. The other thing is obviously when you then go on, if you ever do decide that you want to buy your residential, you no longer have first buyer status because you already own a property. Now, a loophole round this is to possibly buy as a limited company. Now, if you structure a limited company and you buy your first ever property as a limited company, it's the company that's buying the property, not you in your own name. And therefore, you could buy your first investment in a limited company, and then when you go to buy your first residential, your first home, you still have your first time buyer status. So that is a loophole round it. But at the end of the day, you've really got to look at what your strategy is. So I've got a couple of clients that they intend to buy their first property, but within 2 years rent that property out and buy the next one. I've got a client that intends to buy their first property, and because it's not costing them as much, they're not maxing themselves out, so they could afford to buy a much bigger place, closer into London, a more expensive place, but they've decided to just buy something that just works for them for now. And then what they're planning to do is put money aside and then buy their dream home later on. I've also got another client that wants to buy a property now and in 2 years' time buy their first buy-to-let, and then 2 years after that buy a next buy-to-let. So I think when you're looking at property, you really need to decide what you want to get out of it. Like, as I said, the mother that I was talking to a couple of days ago, she was of the opinion, and I'm sure her son has told her this, that he is happy living with his parents. He's really in no rush to move out. So basically, but he has got money and he gets, a high disposable income. So that's basically your net salary that you take home, and then after you pay, like, I don't know if she charges him rent or upkeep of living at home or whatever, but it is, as most people know, when you're living at home with your parents, it's a lot less than if you're living out. So there's room there to save, and if you're earning really good money, and sometimes you might be in the situation that I was in. My parents lived in a really nice area, and I definitely couldn't afford that area. A lot of my cousins, they just loved living really close to town, and their parents' properties were in like zone 1, zone 2, that kind of thing. So they either moved miles away when they finally bought, or they just stayed living as with their parents as long as they could, because they wanted to live in that location they knew they couldn't afford themselves. But if you've got all this money sitting in your bank account and the interest rates for savings, is say 1%, and you could buy a property, rent it out and get a higher return on investment by doing that, then maybe that is also worth it. So I would personally make a decision what you really want to do, where you feel comfortable. I mean, for me, I left home at 18. I went travelling for a year, then I went to university, so I was 22. I came home for, I think it was about 6 weeks, maybe 2 months, before I actually bought my next property, or my first ever property. So it really does depend. For me, once I moved back home, within a couple of weeks, I realised that I had outgrown living at home. But other people, they really love living with their parents, and they could do it for years and years and years and years. So it really does depend on the individual. So for me, it was really important that I bought my first property as a residential. But other people, they are, for whatever reason, happy to live at home with their parents. I've got another client, and his mother isn't 100%, so he has opted to stay living with his mother, but he still wants to get investments on the side. So, you can do that. So you really do need to have a plan. That's all I'm saying. You need to look at it and decide what you want to do and why you want to do it. And depending on that, you need to do research, see how it affects your stamp duty, see how what type of mortgage you need to get, what kind of salary you need to have, because sometimes if you are buying an investment property but you're a non-owner occupier, i.e. you do not own your residential, then the buy-to-let that you're buying won't be based on rental income. It will be, depending on the lender, will be based on your income. So you need to make sure you need to afford that. Plus, a buy-to-let needs 25% deposit when a residential only needs 5% deposit. So can you actually afford to buy a buy-to-let? So these are the things that you really need to look at. So that's what I'd like our Saturday discussion to be. What should your first property be? Should you be a first-time landlord, first-time investor, or should you be a first-time buyer? I mean, what do you guys think? When you're out there about to, buy your first, what do you want to be? what matters to you. I've gone through several different scenarios, clients, friends, obviously my own personal situation. But I mean, what is your opinion? I'd love to know. So please go in the chat and tell me, what would you want to do as your first purchase, your first property purchase? Buy to let or residential? Take care. Have a nice evening. Bye bye.